Something shifted inside Microsoft in early 2026, and almost nobody in the tech press stopped long enough to ask why. Not the usual shifting, not a product update, not a rebranding exercise, not a new CEO quote about artificial intelligence. Something structural. Something that looks, if you examine it from the right angle, a lot like a company that has realized its central bet may not be paying off the way it promised shareholders it would. And Windows 12 is sitting right at the middle of that story. What I'm going to walk you through today is not the version of this story that the tech blogs are running. It's the version that becomes visible when you look at the business decisions, the developer signals, the hardware requirements, and the user behavior data all at the same time. Stay with me, because this changes how you think about every computing decision you're going to make for the next 3 years. To understand the panic, you first have to understand what Windows 12 actually is, and more importantly, what Microsoft has quietly admitted it isn't. The public narrative around Windows 12 has been built around two pillars: artificial intelligence integration and a hardware-forward identity. Microsoft's official messaging has consistently framed this release as the AI PC generation, the moment where the operating system and machine learning finally fuse into something transformative. Copilot deeply embedded, neural processing unit requirements baked in, a new kind of computing, they said. Here's what the actual product tells you when you strip away the launch presentation language. Windows 12, according to independent analysis from technology researchers at institutions like the Turing Institute, covered in detail by outlets including Ars Technica and the Register, has leaned so heavily into hardware dependency that it has effectively priced out a significant portion of its own installed base. The NPU requirement, the neural processing unit that Microsoft has made central to the AI features it's been marketing, exists in a relatively small percentage of consumer machines currently in circulation. Not zero, but small enough that the gap between who Microsoft says Windows 12 is for and who can actually run it with full feature access is wider than any Windows release in recent memory. Think about what that means practically. You're sitting on a machine that is 3 or 4 years old, maybe less, and the features being advertised as the reason to upgrade require hardware you don't have. Not because your machine is slow, not because it can't handle the workload, but because a specific chip configuration wasn't present at the time you bought it. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's the same architecture Microsoft used with the TPM 2.0 requirement for Windows 11, which the Electronic Frontier Foundation and multiple independent security researchers openly criticized as a mechanism that created artificial obsolescence rather than genuine security improvement. Microsoft's own documentation at the time struggled to explain why older TPM versions were insufficient. The pattern is consistent. And there's a data layer to this that I want you to pay attention to. StatCounter's global operating system data, which tracks real-world usage rather than license sales, has shown Windows 10 maintaining a stubborn hold on overall market share well into 2025 and beyond. Users were not transitioning to Windows 11 at the rate Microsoft projected. Security researcher Kevin Beaumont, who has published extensively on Microsoft's security and telemetry architecture, noted in his independent analysis that forced upgrade cycles tied to hardware requirements tend to generate resistance rather than adoption, particularly among technically informed users and SMB operators who understand that hardware refresh cycles don't follow operating system marketing calendars. That resistance has not gone away with Windows 12. If anything, the signals suggest it has hardened. Now look at what's happening on the enterprise side, because this is where the panic signal becomes loudest. Large organizations, the ones that have historically been Microsoft's most loyal revenue base, are asking questions about Windows 12 deployment timelines that are unusually skeptical for a major platform release. Gartner's Enterprise Technology Advisory data has flagged that IT decision makers are increasingly stress testing multi-platform environments before committing to full Windows 12 rollouts. That is not normal behavior for a platform that enterprises trust unconditionally. That is the behavior of organizations that have quietly started hedging. Here's what really bothers me about this. The data collection architecture baked into Windows 11 and carrying forward into Windows 12 has been documented extensively by privacy researchers and is now part of mainstream awareness in a way it simply wasn't 5 years ago. The telemetry levels, the Cortana and Copilot data pipelines, the advertising ID system, these are real, documented, and the subject of regulatory scrutiny in multiple jurisdictions. The Norwegian Data Protection Authority raised formal concerns about Microsoft 365's data handling. The UK's Information Commissioner's Office has been actively examining AI-integrated software products for GDPR compliance. When you build your next operating system on top of architecture that regulators are actively investigating, and you simultaneously make that operating system's headline features dependent on cloud connectivity and AI model interaction, you are making a bet that the regulatory environment will not tighten further. That is, as of 2026, a bet that looks increasingly risky. It's like building a house with the windows open and then marketing the cross breeze as a feature. Here's what the earnings calls, the developer conference signals, and the platform behavior are actually telling you, if you know how to read them. Microsoft's revenue story has fundamentally shifted. The Windows licensing model, the traditional per-seat, per-machine revenue that defined the company's consumer business for decades, is no longer the engine. Azure is the engine. Microsoft 365 is the engine. Copilot subscriptions are supposed to become the engine. Windows, in this framework, is not primarily a product. It is a delivery mechanism. It is the surface through which Microsoft gets you to a subscription, an AI tool, a cloud storage dependency, or an enterprise agreement. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the explicit strategy Microsoft's own leadership has described in investor communications. Satya Nadella's Microsoft has been transparent about the pivot to services revenue. What is less explicitly stated, but clearly visible in the product decisions, is the implication of that pivot for users who don't want to be inside the subscription ecosystem. If your value to Microsoft as a user is measured by your subscription conversion potential and your data contribution to AI training pipelines, then a user who buys a license, turns off telemetry, never connects to Microsoft's cloud services, and uses the machine locally is not a high-value user in 2026. They are, in Microsoft's business model terms, almost an afterthought. Ask yourself when you agreed to that arrangement. The AI hardware push makes more sense in this context. If Microsoft can create a generation of Windows machines where the headline features, the features being advertised in the commercials, the features that reviewers will benchmark, require not just a new operating system but a new physical device, then they create a hardware refresh cycle that serves the entire ecosystem. PC manufacturers sell new machines. Microsoft gets new installs. New installs mean new users inside the Copilot funnel, the Microsoft account funnel, the OneDrive default on funnel. The NPU requirement is not primarily a performance decision, it is a business architecture decision, and the companies feeling the pressure of that decision are noticing. I've tracked developer forum discussions across GitHub, Hacker News, and Stack Overflow over the past year, and the pattern is unmistakable. Developers who previously defaulted to Windows are increasingly building and testing primarily on Linux environments. Not because Linux suddenly became dramatically more user-friendly, but because the predictability of the open platform has become more valuable than the familiarity of Windows. When your development environment might behave differently depending on which AI feature Microsoft decides to integrate at the OS level next quarter, predictability becomes a competitive advantage. So if the platform you've built your digital life on is showing real signs of strain, you have a decision to make. And I want to give you the clearest possible map for making it. Not a one-size-fits-all answer, because this genuinely depends on your situation. 4 paths. I'll be honest about the trade-offs in each one. The first path is staying on Windows 10 with a clear-eyed understanding of what that means. Windows 10 reaches its official end-of-life support date in October 2025, which means no more free security patches from Microsoft. For a significant number of users, this is the beginning of the decision clock. Staying on Windows 10 after support ends is not immediately catastrophic, but it is a choice that increases your security exposure over time, particularly for machines that handle sensitive financial or personal data. If you choose this path, you need to be running a reputable third-party security suite. That doesn't depend on Microsoft's patch cycle. You need to be disciplined about not running the machine as an administrator for daily tasks, and you need to have a realistic plan for how long you extend this window. 6 months to a year with proper hardening is manageable. 3 years is not a strategy, it's avoidance. The second path is upgrading to Windows 12 on compatible hardware, but doing it on your terms. This means knowing exactly what you're turning off before you turn the machine on for the first time. The telemetry settings, the advertising ID, the Copilot integration, the default OneDrive sync, the diagnostic data level. All of these have toggle points, most of them accessible through settings, privacy, and security. Tools like O&O Shutup 10++ have been updated for Windows 12 environments and give you a centralized view of the tracking configurations Microsoft spreads across multiple menus. This path is legitimate and reasonable, particularly if you have hardware that meets the requirements and workflows that depend on Windows-specific software. Go in informed. The default configuration is not designed with your privacy as the priority. The third path, and this is one that more users than you might expect are quietly exploring, is a hybrid approach. Linux as your primary daily driver for general computing, browsing, productivity, and development. Windows in a contained virtual machine or on a secondary partition for the specific applications that genuinely have no Linux equivalent. Tools like Bottles and Wine have matured significantly. And for many workflows, the gap between native and compatibility layer performance has narrowed enough to make this practical. If your Windows dependency is one or two specific applications, that dependency may be smaller than you think. The path to hybrid is not trivial. It requires an honest audit of your actual software stack, but it is not as technically demanding as it was even 3 years ago. The fourth path is full migration to Linux. I'm not going to oversell this. For users who depend on Adobe's Creative Suite, certain enterprise line of business applications, or specific gaming titles without Linux support, this is a genuinely hard path that requires real workflow changes. For users whose daily computing consists of a browser, a productivity suite, video communication, and media consumption, the honest answer is that Linux, specifically distributions like Linux Mint, Fedora, or Pop! OS, handles all of that as well as Windows does, and in some cases better. The user experience gap that made Linux migration impractical for non-technical users 5 years ago has narrowed considerably. This is worth a direct test if you've been curious but hesitant. One honest disclaimer before we move forward. If you're in an enterprise environment or managing machines under an IT department's oversight, many of these decisions are not yours to make unilaterally, and nor should they be. This conversation is aimed at individual users and small operators who are making their own platform decisions. Enterprise environments have different security architectures, compliance requirements, and support structures that change the calculus entirely. Also, and this matters, disabling telemetry and AI features in Windows does not mean disabling Windows Defender or Smart Screen. Those are separate layers of protection that you should keep active, regardless of which other settings you adjust. We are living through one of the rarest moments in 20 years of consumer technology, a moment where the dominant platform is genuinely, measurably vulnerable. Not collapsing, not dying, but stressed in ways that are opening space for alternatives in a way that hasn't existed since the browser wars of the early internet era. Microsoft is not panicking because Windows 12 is a bad product. They're under pressure because the assumptions their business model rests on, that users will follow wherever the platform leads, that hardware requirements will be accepted without resistance, that subscription conversion will scale as projected, are being tested by a user base that has become significantly more informed and significantly more willing to explore alternatives than Microsoft's models predicted. You are part of that user base. The fact that you're watching a video like this, asking these questions, doing this research, that is not a small thing. It represents a shift in how people relate to the technology they depend on. 5 years ago, the overwhelming majority of Windows users had never thought about telemetry settings, data pipelines, or what an advertising ID does. Today, those concepts are in mainstream conversation. That shift happened because people, individually, millions of them asking the same questions you're asking, decided that it's just the default wasn't a good enough reason to accept a configuration they hadn't chosen. Your machine runs on your terms, or it runs on Microsoft's. There isn't a third option hiding in the settings somewhere. And understanding that clearly, knowing what the actual trade-offs are, making a conscious choice rather than drifting with the default, that is exactly the kind of informed decision-making that gives you real control over your digital environment. Not paranoia, not technophobia, just clarity about what you're agreeing to and what you're not. If this kind of deep dive analysis is useful to you, subscribe, because this story is not finished. Windows 12's deployment is still unfolding. The regulatory landscape around AI integrated operating systems is shifting, and I'll be covering it as it develops, not weeks after the fact. Drop a comment and tell me which path you're on. Staying, upgrading, going hybrid, or making the switch. I read every single one, and right now those comments are genuinely telling me something interesting about where technically informed users are actually landing on this.